For better or for worse, the X-Men franchise under 20th Century Studios Fox has had a bumpy ride, let's say. It hasn't always been great, let's be honest, but the X-Men films under Fox have been some of the best comic book films of all time. Without these films, there would be no MCU, there would be no DCEU, there would be no modern-day superhero films. And I personally think that some of these films are the greatest comic book movies and maybe even some of the best movies in the modern era of all time. But there were some downs as well. So in today's video, I'm going to be doing a tier list of all of the Fox X-Men themed properties. Yes, I will be including the 2 Deadpool films as well as sort of spin-offs like the New Mutants. All of those will be included up until the Disney-Fox merger. As always, these are my personal opinions, so if you don't agree with me, then let me know in the comments down below what you think. Massive spoilers ahead for all of these films, you've been warned. And if you haven't subscribed already, then please make sure to do so. And without further ado, let's get into it. Kicking off this list is X-Men Origins Wolverine, which I'm going to put in the D tier. Okay, look, this film is not good, obviously, but in order for me to have put it in the F tier, it would have had to been literally unwatchable. And for all of its faults, I don't think that this film is unwatchable. Maybe. First of all, what is the story of this movie? And why are the Blob and Gambit in a film that they really didn't need to be in? As well as Deadpool. And I mean, we could go on and on and on about what they did to Deadpool, but here's a picture, just to remind you of this wonderful decision. That being said, the origin story of Wolverine is semi-interesting, I guess. It's sort of neat to see how it comes about. Some of the casting is pretty okay. I like Liev Schreiber a lot as Sabretooth. They did cast Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool, albeit this Deadpool. And Hugh Jackman is wonderful as always. But again, this movie has the Blob and Gambit in it for no reason. On top of that, Wolverine's relationship with Silver Fox is just completely forgettable. Makes no sense at all. And does anyone remember there's even a cameo by Professor X in this movie? Really, what was this movie trying to do? But again, just to sum up my thoughts for the third and final time, here's a picture. Deadpool 2 I'm going to put in the A tier. While I don't think it's nearly as strong as the first movie, I think it is plenty strong enough to warrant it being in the A tier. I mean, you take the formula of Ryan Reynolds as the correct Deadpool and just put him in a fun action movie, meta, humorous, all the parts of Deadpool that we just loved from the first film, and you have a recipe for massive success. The story leaves a little bit to be desired, and I much preferred the sidekicks of Colossus and Negasonic in the first Deadpool to Domino and Russell and Juggernaut randomly. But it's just hard to dislike a film like this. It is so surprisingly carefully and seemingly lovingly made. Ryan Reynolds knows that this is the second chance that he almost didn't get, and he's running with it. Running with it apparently all the way to Deadpool 3 at Marvel Studios. There you go. Speaking of the first Deadpool is going in the A tier as well. While perhaps not one of the greatest comic book movies of all time in my personal opinion, this movie is a delight. This movie showed the potential of Deadpool realized on the big screen with the perfect casting in Ryan Reynolds. I think comparable to even Hugh Jackman and Robert Downey Jr. The action is great, it's pretty visceral, although the action in Deadpool 2 is a little better, I will give it that. But the humor, the meta jokes, the references, the dialogue, and even the internal conflict and the emotional struggle that Wade Wilson goes through in this bizarre, wacky film makes for a pretty surprisingly complete package. Entertaining from beginning to end, one of the better things to come out of the Fox X-Men universe. X-Men Days of Future Past I'm going to put in the S tier. This is still one of my favorite comic book movies of all time. When I first saw it in 2014, I thought, this is something special. And I kept waiting and waiting for the years to go by, and for me to say, well, it's maybe not as good as it used to be. I mean, come on, Infinity War, Endgame, but after seeing it again, this movie is still phenomenal. It takes everything you loved about First Class, everything you loved about the original trilogy, and just mashes them together into one glorious film. And of course, Hugh Jackman is the centerpiece to all of it, and it's perfect. I mean, for me at least, this movie somehow managed to do time travel about as well as you could ever do time travel in a comic book film. For as great as Avengers Endgame is, this film does time travel way simpler and honestly, in my opinion, way better. Because with the parallel timelines, you're able to have true genuine stakes as time continues to move in the present. And the dual battles at the end of the past and the future going simultaneously is one of my favorite things about any comic book movie in the last few years. Oh, and also old Professor X talking to young Professor X is probably one of the best scenes I've ever seen from an X-Men film. Next up is X-Men The Last Stand, which I'm going to put in the C tier. So, a lot of people seem to think this is one of the worst comic book movies, if not one of the worst movies ever released. And if you do, more power to you, but I personally think this movie is okay. Don't get me wrong, it is not good by any stretch of the imagination, but it's watchable, and even more than watchable, it's okay. Yes, killing off Cyclops and killing off Professor X very unceremoniously was questionable. And you could tell right away this wasn't Bryan Singer. This was a different director and Brett Ratner, and he just wanted to do something different. But the way that they handled the Dark Phoenix storyline, it could have been a lot better. I mean, it could have been a lot worse, hint hint, but could have been better. However, the ending fight at San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge scene, those are still pretty iconic and pretty cool to watch. And at the end of the day, once you turn this film off, I would even go so far to venture that you would have been entertained. Maybe. X2 X-Men United I'm going to put in the S tier. If you want to talk about ahead of its time, this movie was made almost 20 years ago. That is insane. Arguably, this is still one of the greatest comic book movies of all time, and it stands up. It really holds up well. Take everything that you enjoyed about the first X-Men film. Great characters, great casting, good action that got even better in the second film, great story, a great message about discrimination and about fitting into society, add some new great characters in Iceman and Pyro, and add some great scenes in the X-Mansion raid scene and Wolverine versus Lady Deathstrike, you got yourself an amazing film. X-Men Apocalypse is going in the C tier. Look, this could have been a lot worse, but for me, more than that, it could have been a lot better. Listen, I love Oscar Isaac as an actor, I do, but either he was the wrong casting or something about the makeup and the prosthetics just didn't work, because this Apocalypse design, this guy, that's not Apocalypse. This is Apocalypse. I don't know, every time I saw him on screen and every time I heard him talk, I wanted to laugh. He's not intimidating, he looks goofy, he looks like he's from the 90s. Something about him, I just don't understand how this VFX and the CGI model got approved, because it doesn't look good. Aside from Apocalypse, this is about as generic of a superhero film as you can get, especially having come out in the modern comic book movie age. If this had come out 20 years ago, this would have been a phenomenal film. But where have we seen the destruction of basically the entire world, debris flying everywhere, CGI everything, and a generic villain? Basically every comic book film before 2010. This film does have some good moments, though. I think the Magneto family arc is one of the best parts of this movie, easily, and Michael Fassbender and James McAvoy give great performances as always. Nice to see Hugh Jackman in there. I don't love the new cast, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a little bit. I just don't think they lend themselves that well to the role, especially Sophie Turner, who I think is a great actress, but I just don't think she's a great Jean Grey. And at the end of the day, well, you watch the film and you watch all the X-Men at the end in the Danger Room, and you go, well, that was an X-Men film. Dark Phoenix is going in the D tier. Again, it's not going in the F tier because it is not literally unwatchable. In fact, I had the great pleasure of watching it twice in theaters, and probably will never see it again. This is not a good movie. It's just a poorly constructed film. And you can tell that Simon Kinberg has no idea what he's doing. And that's not his fault. He's a writer and a producer by nature. So to have him direct a film, well, that's a big ask. It legitimately is. But after you botched the Dark Phoenix saga before, probably should have learned from some of your mistakes. I guess he didn't. Because this film is somehow worse than X-Men The Last Stand, inexplicably. Again, I think Sophie Turner, who is a great actress, is not a great Jean Grey at all. And her portrayal of the Phoenix Force, not good. Something about this movie kind of feels cheap. It's generic. And all of the characters just seem off. Professor X is a snob. He's a huge prick in this film. I'm not entirely sure what went wrong with this movie, but this movie is only saved by some good performances, being Michael Fassbender and James McAvoy struggling their way through an otherwise pretty terrible film. The ending action was okay, but too little, too late. The Wolverine is going in the B tier. If ever there was a movie to go in a B tier, it would be The Wolverine. This movie is the definition of a B movie. It is good, not great. It is likable, but not lovable. The Wolverine has promise, and it showed that James Mangold was capable of making a good comic book movie, and we're going to see that in just a second. But this film has some problems, especially in the third act, of course, that everyone talks about, where it kind of just devolves into the normal superhero tropes. Wolverine fighting a giant mech didn't really make sense. The villains were not very well defined. I like the change in setting for sure. I really did enjoy Wolverine in Japan. I just don't know if they utilized it to the best of their ability. And again, I really enjoyed the basic premise of Wolverine being vulnerable, having this condition or this parasite eating away at his healing condition. Don't think all of that was explored very well. Like the scene where he's pulling out the thing in the surgery table, great, but now that whole thing is gone. I would have much rather had it be some sort of condition or virus rather than a parasite that he could just pull out with his claws. Kind of like Spider-Man 2, where Spider-Man just loses his powers, you know? But anyways, this movie's fine. It's forgettable, it's good, you'll enjoy it when you watch it maybe once or twice, but after that, why bother? Speaking of James Mangold though, Logan S Tier. Not only is this one of my favorite comic book movies of all time, this is one of my favorite movies of all time, period. What James Mangold was able to do with a character like Logan and take that R rating and not just make it an R rating for the sake of an R rating, but truly utilize it to tell a deeper, darker, but ultimately maybe hopeful story is incredible. This is not a comic book movie. I mean, it is, but what this film really is striving to be and what it succeeds in doing is being a character study. The reason that this movie is called Logan is because it is about Logan. It is a study in a man who has lost the will to live but is pushing forward for Charles. And then he loses Charles, but he finds X-23 Laura and he's pushing forward. It's about a man finding purpose. There's something beautiful about that. There really is. Of course, the action is great, but you don't watch this movie for the action alone, although it is great. Patrick Stewart gives an Academy Award-winning level performance. Daphne Keane as X-23 is great. The villains are probably not my favorite thing. I'm not entirely in love with X-24, I will admit right now, but at the end of the day, it really isn't about them. It's about Logan, as the movie suggests, and I'm fine with that, because this is one of the most beautiful, haunting, and well-constructed comic book movies of all time. The first X-Men film is going the A tier. Now, if you look at this film in terms of today's context, it is pretty okay. In fact, it's pretty good. And what this movie has going for it is that everything that it tries to do, it does well. There is nothing that it does that it doesn't at least make some impact, make a dent in what it was trying to do. For example, visual effects for the time were pretty good. The message of the story, very good. The casting, the characters, very good. There's nothing that it does egregiously wrong. And if you're looking at this film in terms of the context, of course we all have to thank this movie coming out over 20 years ago to be the catalyst for films like The Avengers, The Dark Knight, Logan. But this movie on its own is pretty good. Hugh Jackman is inspired casting, at least for the time, but he and the rest of the cast prove that superhero films don't have to be goofy or campy. They can be dark. You can wear the black leather suits and be cool as well. Magneto's conflict with Professor X is brilliant. Magneto is one of the greatest comic book movie villains of all time. I'm gonna say it. He has a dark backstory. The film opens up in a German concentration camp, and it's just dark. This movie is not afraid to do anything, whether it be a sort of goofy, campy superhero finale action scene or a dark, serious film with a message about discrimination against people who are different. The New Mutants is going in the C tier. This movie's fine. For all the production delays and everything that it had to go through, I think this movie is fine. You have a pretty decent cast: Anya Taylor-Joy, Maisie Williams, Charlie Heaton, but at the end of the day, you have a sort of generic, sometimes fun, sometimes boring horror film. It could have been so much more, but it could have been so much worse. And at the end of the day, given all of the production delays and production horror stories, if you will, no pun intended, I can't fault this film for being as plain as it is. So I'll put New Mutants for now in the C tier. Maybe this film will grow on me with time, who knows. And finally, X-Men First Class I'm going to put in the B tier. A lot of people really like this film, say it's one of the best comic book movies, one of the best X-Men films. Me personally, I think it has some great moments in it. I also think there are some pretty campy, cheesy moments in it as well. The whole "you're Magneto and you're Professor X" scene, okay, great. Origin stories for their names, I get it, but Jennifer Lawrence in this film was interesting. But the casting was inspired. Magneto, Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy as Professor X, even Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique as well. Nicholas Hoult as Beast. Kevin Bacon as Sebastian Shaw, the villain, I thought was great. And the historical setting of the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis was also a really nice touch. I like that it was a mini period piece. I just think that this film, outside of those things, was, well, I've said it before, it was an X-Men film. I think it was a good X-Men film, but it didn't necessarily do anything to reinvent the wheel. And that's the case with a lot of these movies. Once the first X-Men sort of defined the mold, a lot of these movies followed in its footsteps. For example, X-Men Apocalypse, in my opinion, X-Men First Class. But some of these films were not afraid to push the envelope and break out of that bubble. Deadpool, Logan. And again, X-Men First Class and Logan are two of my favorite comic book movies of all time. So, while I'm sure Kevin Feige will do an amazing job with the mutants over at Marvel and Disney, and I'm really excited to see what they're going to do with the Fantastic Four, I can't help but wonder, what other great X-Men movies would we have gotten had Fox remained independent? But that was my tier list for the X-Men Fox films. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below where you would put these films on a tier list. While you're at it, please make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. And if you want to check out some more videos, check out the videos on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.